Naomi never planned to become anyone's cautionary tale or anyone's hope. But the first time she told her husband Eli that she didn't want to do something, her hands were trembling so hard she had to set down the dish towel before she dropped it. It wasn't fear of him. He had never raised his voice in anger, never threatened her, never so much as slammed a door. She was shaking because in 26 years of life inside the conservative Mennonite settlement of Birch Hollow, tucked into the hill country of eastern Ohio, she had never once watched anyone show her what that sentence sounded like coming out of a woman's mouth. "I don't want to." 4 small words. They felt like stones in her throat, foreign and heavy, borrowed from some other woman's life that had never been offered to her. She stood at the counter that morning with the kitchen window throwing pale early light across the linoleum, and she braced for the floor to open beneath her. It didn't. The kettle kept ticking on the stove. The dog scratched at the back door the way he always did. Nothing collapsed. But what happened in the hour after that taught her more about what she'd survived than 2.5 decades inside the community ever had. Before she goes any further, her name is Naomi, and this channel, the one you're watching right now, is called Naomi's Quiet Way. She grew up in Birch Hollow, in a conservative Mennonite church that some of her relatives still attend, and this is the place where she finally lets herself say the things that community would never have permitted her to say out loud, even to herself. If this is the kind of honesty you've been looking for, she'd be grateful if you'd subscribe, tap that like button, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what she shares next. It matters more than you'd think. Now let her tell you what nobody ever told her directly. When people outside that world hear that wives in a community like hers are expected to defer to their husbands, they picture something specific. They picture a woman cowering, a man's raised hand, a locked door. That is not the picture, and that's exactly what makes the real thing so much harder for outsiders, and even for the women themselves, to see clearly. What it actually looks like is a Wednesday morning, a woman rising at 5, before her husband, before her 3 children, before the sun has even decided to bother with the day, dressing in the dark so as not to wake anyone, lighting the stove, going out to the hen house in air cold enough to fog her breath, coming back inside with red cheeks and aching hands to have breakfast on the table before anyone else sits down to eat it. What it looks like is a woman who never learned how to want anything for herself, not because she was foolish, not because she was weak, but because every structure surrounding her from the moment she could understand language had been quietly, patiently, thoroughly built to make wanting feel indistinguishable from sin. There was no rule written down in the church's discipline that said a wife may never refuse her husband. There didn't need to be one. You don't need a law against something a culture has already made unthinkable. And by the time most girls in Birch Hollow grew up and married, the idea of refusal hadn't been forbidden to them. It had simply never been placed on the table as something that existed. That distinction took Naomi the longest time to understand, and it's the part she most needs you to hear now. She was taught 3 things about marriage before she ever entered into one. She was taught them through sermons. She was taught them by watching her mother move through the house like a current that never stopped. She was taught them through 1,000 small, ordinary moments that accumulate into a world view long before a girl is old enough to question any of it. The first thing she was taught was that a wife's role inside marriage is service, not partnership. To support, to tend, to maintain, to yield, her own comfort, her own preferences, the quiet landscape of her inner life. These were allowed to exist, technically, but only in whatever scraps of space remained after every other obligation had been met first. The second thing she was taught was that disagreement wasn't a tool for communication. It was a spiritual failure. When a wife pushed back against her husband's decision, she wasn't offering a different point of view. She was demonstrating a lack of faith. There was a word the older women used for the posture a wife was meant to hold, a a kind of complete surrender of will, surrender to God first, and her husband's leadership was understood to be the structure through which that surrender was practiced. To resist him, in the deepest sense the community understood it, was to resist something sacred. The third thing she was taught was that a wife's happiness inside the marriage was never really the point, not because anyone wished her unhappiness, but because patient endurance was treated as its own form of faithfulness. Suffering quietly was virtue. Wanting comfort, naming your own needs out loud, prioritizing your own feelings. This fell under a word that meant something close to pride, and pride was the gravest failing a person could carry. A woman who advocated for herself too plainly, too often, too audibly, wasn't standing up for herself. In the eyes of the community, she was failing God. None of this arrived as a list. No one ever sat young Naomi down and handed her a set of rules about what she was and wasn't allowed to want. That isn't how conditioning works. It works like water, slow, everywhere, all at once, until it has reshaped the entire landscape of a person from the inside, and the person can no longer see the shape because she has never known any other one. She wants to tell you about something that happened during her first year of marriage, something that would mean nothing at all to a person who had never lived inside that kind of world, and would mean everything to someone who had. She and Eli were deciding something about the dairy operation his family ran, whether to take on a second hired hand for the season or hold off and manage with just the two of them and his younger brother. She doesn't remember every detail anymore. What she remembers is that she had an opinion, not a dramatic one, not a crisis. Just a quiet, steady sense that they were about to make a choice that didn't sit right with her and that she could see another way of doing it. She remembers sitting at their kitchen table that evening, the oil lamp throwing its familiar yellow light across the wood grain between them, and she remembers opening her mouth to speak and then closing it, and opening it again, and then looking down at her own hands instead. She didn't say anything, not because Eli would have been angry, not because there would have been any visible consequence at all, but because something inside her, something old enough that it didn't even register as a thought anymore, simply felt like fact. Something in her did not believe she was allowed to disagree. So they went forward with his plan, and she carried her unspoken opinion around with her for weeks afterward, like a small stone tucked into a coat pocket, occasionally remembering it was there, wondering, almost idly, what might have happened if she'd let it fall out onto the table that night. This is what that kind of deference looks like from the inside. Not a raised hand, not a raised voice, just a woman sitting at a table, looking at her own hands, deciding that what she thinks doesn't need to be spoken, deciding it so automatically that she barely registers having made any decision at all. Now here is the part that surprised her most, the part that still surprises her even now, years after she left, years after therapy, years after building a life where she has slowly learned to say what she thinks and want what she wants and ask plainly for what she needs. Most of the men inside that system were not cruel. Most of them weren't even aware of what the system was quietly doing to their wives. They had been raised inside the same water. They were taught that leadership meant decision-making, that headship was a spiritual responsibility rather than a form of control, that a wife who deferred to her husband was honoring God, not erasing herself. They were taught that a quiet wife was a contented wife, that a woman who never complained simply had nothing to complain about, that everything, by definition, was fine. And because the women had been so thoroughly trained to give off no visible signal, to need nothing out loud, to ache silently, to fold themselves smaller and smaller until they occupied exactly the amount of space permitted to them. Nena, the men, often, genuinely could not see what was happening right in front of them. Naomi told her therapist once about a specific evening, years into her marriage. She described sitting at that table, mouth opening, mouth closing, saying nothing, carrying that unspoken thought for weeks afterward, like something in her pocket. Her therapist looked at her for a long moment and said, "That isn't deference. That's self-erasure. And you practiced it for so long you stopped recognizing it as a practice at all." Those words cracked something open in her. Because her therapist was right. She hadn't been yielding out of faith. She had been disappearing out of conditioning. And the gap between those two things, that gap is everything. She wants to be careful here because she knows what some of you might be thinking. You're thinking, but some women genuinely choose this life. Some women want a traditional marriage. Some women find real meaning in service and homemaking and deference. And you'd be right. That exists, and it's not what she's describing. Chosen submission, inside a relationship where both people have full information, full freedom, and a genuine, unforced ability to walk away if they wanted to, is an entirely different thing from what she lived. What she's describing is a system that removes the ability to choose before the question is ever even asked. A system that shapes a girl from infancy to believe her own desires are dangerous, her opinions are arrogance, her discomfort is spiritual weakness, and her silence is the truest measure of her faith. A system that marries her off at 18 or 19, before she has any reference point for what another kind of life might feel like, before she can even imagine what it would be to say no and have that be acceptable, before she has a single word for what is actually happening inside her. A real choice requires real options. Options you can see, touch, understand. Picture yourself living inside. The girls Naomi grew up with were handed exactly one option and taught, gently and completely, to call it everything there was. She left when she was 27. The distancing from her family was immediate and quiet in its own way. Phone calls that went unanswered, then unreturned, letters that came back to her still sealed, a mother whose voice she still hears, sometimes late at night, warm and utterly certain, telling her that the way they lived was the only way worth living. She doesn't share this for sympathy. She shares it because leaving is the question people ask her most often. And leaving, it turns out, taught her more clearly than anything else how complete the conditioning had actually been. Because even after she physically left, even after she had her own small apartment in Canton, her own job at a school office, her own income, a therapist helping her find language for what she'd lived through, even then, the old instinct to yield, to shrink, to avoid wanting things too loudly, to make herself easy and agreeable, to swallow whatever she actually thought and hand over something softer instead. That instinct didn't stay behind in Birch Hollow. It came with her in the car. You carry the water with you long after you've left the river. If you're watching this, and something in what she's said feels uncomfortably familiar, not because you grew up Mennonite or Amish, or in any closed community at all, but because you grew up somewhere, in some family, that taught you your needs were too much, your voice took up too much room, your wanting was selfish. She'd love for you to subscribe and stay close because she shares stories like this every week, right here on this channel. If you can, hit subscribe, tap the like button, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. It would mean a great deal. There's so much more she hasn't said yet. The thing she wishes someone had told her, not just told her, but shown her, demonstrated in the actual texture of daily life, is that a relationship is not weakened by a woman's voice inside it. It is not destabilized by her preferences. It does not fall apart simply because she occasionally wants something different from what her husband wants. A marriage in which one person has genuinely lost the capacity to say no isn't a sacred union. It's one person and an echo of themselves. She knows that might sound harsh. She knows there are people listening right now who would say she's misunderstanding the theology, that she's importing outside values onto a system built on entirely different foundations. She has heard that argument many times, and she has sat with it honestly for a long while. And here is where she has landed. No theology she is willing to follow requires a woman to vanish inside her own life. No faith worth keeping asks her to express her devotion through her own erasure. Whatever real submission means, and she believes it can mean something genuine, something mutual, something freely chosen between two people who see each other fully. It cannot mean that one person's voice simply stops existing in the room. That isn't faith. That's only silence, dressed up in faith's clothing. The morning she finally told Eli she didn't want to do something, she was shaking. She told you that already. What she didn't tell you yet is what happened next. He looked at her, and there was no anger in his face, no confusion either. What was there looked closer to relief, as though he had been waiting a very long time for her to step fully into their marriage as a complete person, as though her years of silence had been a weight he, too, had been quietly carrying without ever knowing its name. She thought about every table they had sat at together, every lamp burning low between them, every thought she had folded up and tucked into her own pocket instead of speaking, every decision he had made inside a silence she herself had helped build. Every way the two of them had been failed together by a system that handed them a marriage neither of them had been given the tools to actually live inside. They didn't manage to fix it, not really, not in the way you'd hope. They were too far inside something that required more than two well-meaning people simply trying harder. But that morning, she understood something she's thought about almost daily ever since. The system doesn't only take from the women caught inside it. It takes from everyone. It takes from the men the chance to be questioned, challenged, and changed by someone who loves them. It takes from marriages the chance to be real, fully inhabited by two whole people. It takes from faith the chance to be chosen rather than simply inherited and performed on schedule. And it takes all of this so quietly that most people living inside it never even hear what's being removed from their lives. If you grew up believing your silence was your virtue, she sees you. If you were taught that wanting things made you weak and disagreeing made you sinful, you are not alone in that. If you have ever sat at a table with a thought sitting heavy in your mouth and chosen to swallow it because something old and invisible inside you said you weren't allowed to speak it, she sees you too. You were allowed, you still are. If any part of this reached you, she'd be grateful if you'd subscribe, like the video, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what she shares next time. And there is, she promises, still so much more she hasn't said. Until next time, choose your freedoms carefully. They might be the thing that saves you.